finally, the last piece of the Sahel, as we look deeply into what the country's leader is doing on infrastructural development. In our analysis of both Burkina and Mali, one thing is common: development. Today, Niger comes to the spotlight. Stay with me. Niamey is now at the center of a very different kind of map. And it's not just lines on paper anymore. It's power lines, rail projects, and pipelines being planned or pushed across the Sahel. And Niger's leaders are under pressure to answer a simple but tough question. How do they chase rapid infrastructure development while also trying to gain more political and economic independence? For a landlocked country that's long been described as one of the poorest states in the region and heavily dependent on outside support, that tension has moved right into the middle of a bigger regional debate about what role Niger wants to play next. In this episode, we will walk you through the 2023 military takeover, the regional sanctions that followed, and the break with regional economic rules turned Niger from a relatively quiet security partner into a test case for a whole Sahel. We track how the new authorities have started reviewing old arrangements, how big foreign money roads, rail, and pipelines almost always comes with conditions, and why some voices in Niger now say the country should stop thinking for itself only as a transit route and start seeing itself as a possible regional crossroads. We will follow the story from uranium and oil deals through the impacts of sanctions, of prices and supply chains, and into the diplomatic spaces where governments and partners are watching closely. The quick question is whether Niger can use this moment to claim more control over its infrastructure and resources, or whether today's choices could lock in new weaknesses before any long-term vision becomes real. By the end, Niger's path looks less like a distant policy argument and more like a concrete set of trade-offs that many African countries under similar pressure may soon recognize. In Niamey, the recent political and economic shifts are playing out against long-running plans for power lines, transport links, and energy routes across the Sahel. For years, Niger was widely seen as a cooperative partner. He hosted foreign forces under security deals, took part in uranium and counterterrorism arrangements, and worked inside regional and international systems where many big infrastructure design followed outside and regional priorities more than its own. That picture changed sharply under the military after it took power in mid-2023, and regional sanctions came down. A major neighbor cut off electricity exports to Niger, and border and airspace limits hit trade and transport, with clear effects on energy supplies and prices on the ground. As this was happening, officials and commentators in and around Niger started talking more openly about a Sahel blueprint. A vision of Niger not just as a landlocked country under pressure, but as a possible connector between North, West, and parts of Central Africa. In that vision, railways aren't just routes to the coast, they are also potential links among Sahel economics. Power lines aren't only about imports, they are tied to Niger's oil and solar potential and the idea that one day the country could generate and even export more energy itself. But there is a catch. Many of these projects, whether proposed or already underway, still depend heavily on outside money, expertise, and companies. So, the dilemma keeps coming back. The fastest way to build big infrastructure is usually with foreign capital, while the political goal is to gain more national and regional control over those same networks. That tension now sits at the heart of the argument over who really shapes Niger's long-term infrastructure agenda. When military officers took power in Niamey in 2023, voices outside the country focused first on the unconstitutional change of government and the reaction from regional bodies and other partners. Inside Niger, the same moment opened up a space to re-examine security, economic and infrastructure arrangements with outside actors. Sanctions, airspace closures, and border limits didn't just hit the authorities. They exposed how much Niger's food, electricity, and trade flows depended on regional and external systems that could be cut back very quickly. Under this pressure, the new leadership still had to keep day-to-day governance running. But the crisis also pushed a deeper questions into the spotlight. If essential supplies could be interrupted by decisions taken elsewhere, how solid were the old arrangements they had been relying on? At the same time, neighboring like Mali and Burkina Faso had already shifted their security partnerships, reduced or ended cooperation with former military allies, and framed those moves as steps towards more sovereignty. Niger's choices to move closer to these neighbors and join a Sahel alliance and start steering away from older regional economic frameworks gave fresh weight to talks of a shared Sahel project. And inside that context, the Sahel blueprint idea gained ground in policy and media conversations. Roads were being discussed not only as paths to ports, but as lines connecting Sahel capitals to each other. Energy strategies started to focus more on diversifying supply and reducing heavy dependence on a single neighbor. Security cooperation was recast as an effort to let Sahel governments take more direct charge of their own territory. Still, one hard reality remained. Any long-term redesign would need large amounts of money. And the question of who puts that money on the table and under what conditions stayed right at the center of the debate across Africa. Big offers of loans and investment for transport, energy, and industrial projects are attractive to governments facing serious infrastructure gaps. Niger is no different. Fresh or upgraded roads, lines, or power plants promise growth, jobs, and better connections. But Africans experience this kind of external financials. There's usually more in that print. Requirements that a large slice of the contracts go to the companies from the leader's country, and, in some cases, repayments tied to future export earnings from key resources. As Niger's blueprint discussions move forward, policymakers and analysts drew lessons from other states where big projects did bring new highways or power stations, but they left governments carrying heavy debts, limited local participations, or new pressure points that lenders could use when budgets became tight. Inside Niger, the debate is now partly about timing and risk. One camp says the infrastructure gap is so wide that delays are themselves costly, and that moving fast is essential if Niger wants to break out of old patterns. Another camp warns that looking into long-term deals during a time of political and economic stress could reduce future options, especially if the projects mainly serve exporting raw materials instead of building local industries and value chains. Through all this, one idea keeps coming up. Niger doesn't want to remain just a small link in someone else's supply chain. The hope is to position the country inside a Sahel economic corridor with more negotiating power. But for now, that's still more of an ambition than a finished plan, and its final shape is far from settled. On any regional map, Niger sits where several major routes connecting the central Sahel to coastal countries and even towards North America. For a long time, those routes were seen in mostly practical terms. They moved goods, people, and fuel under existing trade and security arrangements without much talk about deeper strategy. The new blueprint narrative tries to flip that perspective. It treats Niger's geography as a potential source of leverage, positioning the country as a crossroads for flows between West, North, and parts of Central Africa. In that framing, some rail and road projects are described not just as paths to individual ports, but as ways to build more horizontal connections between Sahel streets so that region isn't over-dependent on a single corridor. Energy planning is also being talked about differently. There are discussions about linking oil productions, refining and power generations into the region first, and then exporting any surplus instead of supply, pushing raw materials out. These ideas echo broader African efforts to boost trade within the continent and break away from transport patterns that still resemble old colonial routes. Security cooperation under the Sahel Alliance is being promoted as another piece of this puzzle. It's been presented as a way to secure core routes with forces mandated by governments in the region, even while they rethink partnerships with outside security actors. But turning maps and discussions into working networks is complicated. For Niger, any version of these blueprints demands stable public finances, predictable income from resources and trade, and the institution's strength to negotiate and carry out deals with several neighbors and external partners all at once. All of this is happening while larger powers continue to see Niger's positions and corridors as improvements for their own economic and security interests, which means, hear me loudly, every big infrastructure decision comes with multiple layers of negotiations attached. For decades, Niger's name on the international stage has been closely tied to uranium and more recently to oil. Uranium from Niger has fed nuclear industries abroad, especially in Europe, under long-running contracts. Now, those deals have brought in money for the states, but it also sparked criticisms at home and abroad over how the revenue is shared, what exactly reaches local communities, and how much control the country really has over its own strategic resources. Oil has now moved into the center of Niger's economic thinking. A major export pipeline running from Niger through a neighboring coastal state to the Atlantic built that heavy foreign investment. Now, this is meant to carry large volumes of crude oil at once. It's fully up and running. On one side, this line could bring in important income and pull Niger deeper into regional energy markets. On the other side, the pipe stretches across Africa borders so that any tension between governments, security problems, or regulatory disputes along the route can disrupt flows, which means we've already seen periods where cross-border issues affected exports. Similar patterns show up in uranium and other minerals. Existing licenses and contracts limit how fast and on what terms Niger can try to change its position. Moving too fast could trigger legal and financial pushback. Moving slowly, through gradual negotiation, demands a strong administration and careful diplomacy. As Niger and its Sahel partners talk more openly about resource sovereignty, outside governments and companies are watching closely. They understand that any shift in contract terms or export patterns could affect their own supply security, investment choices, and wider political relations with the region. For people in Niamey and other towns, big debates about sovereignty and infrastructure show up in every simple ways. The cost of food, whether fuel is available, and how often the light stays on. After the military took over in 2023, sanctions from regional bodies and a series of border closures disrupted formal trade and financial flows. A major neighbor's decision to stop exporting electricity cut a supply that had previously covered a large share of Niger's power needs. Now, this is interesting. Those moves added strain to a country that already imports much of its food and fuel. Households, traders, and small business owners have had to adjust to new supply routes, higher transport costs, and, in many cases, a greater dependence on generators or informal supply chains when official ones fail. Supporters of the current path say these hardships are part of the price of standing more firmly on national decisions and pushing back against what they see as outside interference. Among some groups, especially sections of the youth in parts of the Sahel who are frustrated with old political elites and long-running external partnerships, there have been visible shows of support for leaders who promise to resist pressure and seek new alliances. At the same time, many low-income families and local producers are dealing with real uncertainty as costs rise and markets shift. In practice, the credibility of any blueprint is tested not just in speeches, but in how policies turn into services, support, and real opportunities on the ground. If economic strain continues without clear improvements, public patience could wear thin, especially if people feel that most of the benefits are going to a small circle rather than being shared more widely. In meetings in Niamey, across other Sahel capitals, and in partner countries, the conversation about Niger keeps coming back to a core question. Can this current direction produce a stable model? Or is it more likely to drive tensions higher with nuclear results? Niger is trying to juggle urgent infrastructure needs, long-standing question over who controls its resources, shifting regional alliances, and a stated push for more autonomy. All of this while facing security threats and economic pressure linked to sanctions and changing partnerships. Observers often sketch out a few broad paths. One scenario imagines negotiated arrangements that let Niger and its Sahel partners secure better terms for investment and cooperation, while slowly rebuilding some regional and international ties. Another scenario points to a longer standoff, with deeper economic and diplomatic isolation and spillover effects on trade, public finances, and security. But in reality, the outcome will depend on choices taken by Niger's authorities, regional organizations, and outside actors over time. Elsewhere on the continent, other governments are watching closely, especially where there are already arguments over foreign troops, regional integration, and control of strategic sectors. For many in Pan-African and diaspora spaces, Niger's experience has turned into a reference point in wider debates about how African states deal with powerful external players and big multilateral institutions. The way relations evolve between the Sahel Alliance, regional blocs, and broader international partners will send a signal about how far military-led governments can actually reshape regional cooperation and external engagements. In the end, Niger's evolving Sahel blueprint is less a fixed plan and more of a life experiment. It's being tested day by day by economic trends, security conditions, and public reactions. Whether it's later remembered as a set or a step towards greater room to maneuver, or as a warning about the risks of sudden rupture, this will depend on how those pressures play out in the months and years ahead. This is Frontline Africa. If this kind of unfiltered Africa First analysis resonates with you, make sure you are subscribed. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. And drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear what you think. My name is P. Solomon, and I'll see you in the next episode.